Humanity had long been proud of its achievements, but nothing could have prepared them for the sudden, unexpected arrival of the Zrathar. These ancient, cold-blooded beings had watched the rise of human civilization from afar, content to observe until the time was right to make their move. The galaxy, once thought to be peaceful, was about to be thrown into chaos, and humans would soon find out that their place in the universe was far more fragile than they had ever imagined. It began on a quiet Tuesday morning, just like any other, when the first signs of the alien invasion appeared. It wasn't a massive fleet or an overwhelming attack. It was something far subtler. A strange energy anomaly appeared in Earth's atmosphere. It was faint at first, barely noticeable to anyone except the most skilled astronomers. But as the days passed, the anomaly grew stronger, its presence more pronounced. News outlets began to report it as an unusual phenomenon, an unexplained flare of energy from deep space. Scientists across the globe were baffled, unsure of its origin or its significance. Then, without warning, the first true indication of the threat arrived. The Zrathar warships. Massive, dark, and menacing, they came from beyond the stars, descending into Earth's atmosphere with terrifying speed. The ships were unlike anything humanity had ever seen, sleek, almost organic in their design, with smooth surfaces that shimmered like black glass. Their arrival caused panic across the world, and within hours, military forces were mobilized to defend the planet. For the first time, humanity faced an enemy that didn't follow any rules of war they knew. The Zrathar were not like any of the alien species humans had encountered before. Their technology was far beyond anything humanity had ever dreamed of, and their methods of warfare were ruthless and precise. These beings didn't come to conquer with armies or brute force. They came to annihilate, to wipe out everything in their path with cold efficiency. The world watched in horror as their weapons began to activate. The first test of their power was an energy beam shot from one of their ships, aimed directly at a military base in the Pacific. The moment the beam hit, the ground shattered, splitting open like a cracked egg. Buildings were flattened, soldiers and civilians alike were torn apart by the sheer power of the blast. The human military retaliated, launching fighter jets and missiles, but it was clear from the start that their weapons were useless. The Zrathar ship was impenetrable, its shields absorbing every attack with ease. Panic spread as it became apparent that humanity's defenses were no match for this new enemy. As the days went on, the Zrathar warships moved steadily across the globe, hitting key military installations, power grids, and communication hubs. The world's leaders were left scrambling, unsure of how to respond. The United Nations held emergency sessions, but no one had any answers. The weapons of the Zrathar were beyond comprehension, and the human race seemed powerless in the face of this unknown threat. In the midst of the chaos, a small group of scientists, working out of an underground bunker, began to make a shocking discovery. As they examined the remains of the Zrathar weapon, they found something that didn't make sense. The technology, as advanced as it was, had one fatal flaw. It was designed to destroy everything in its path, but it seemed to have no effect on certain biological materials, specifically human skin. The scientists were stunned. Could it be possible? Could humanity's natural biology hold the key to their survival? They ran test after test, desperately trying to understand why human tissue was not responding to the Zrathar weapons in the same way as the rest of the planet's life forms. And then, after weeks of research, the answer came to light. Human skin had evolved to be far more resilient than anyone had ever known. It wasn't just the skin's physical properties. It was something deeper, a biological trait embedded in the very DNA of humanity. The scientists theorized that over centuries, humans had developed a unique genetic resistance to extreme environmental stressors, making their bodies naturally more resilient to energy-based attacks. The Zrathar had never encountered anything like it. Their superweapons, designed to destroy anything they touched, had no effect on humans, and this revelation could be the key to turning the tide. Back on the front lines, however, Humanity was still struggling to hold its ground. Despite the discovery, they were still vastly outmatched by the alien forces. The Zrathar continued their attacks, growing increasingly frustrated as they realized their weapons were ineffective. They had underestimated the human race, and now they were learning a bitter lesson. In the midst of the chaos, one of the Zrathar commanders, a calculating and ruthless leader named Serac, began to consider a new strategy. He called for a retreat, something the Zrathar had never done before. They had always seen themselves as invincible, but now they were facing an enemy they could not defeat, at least not in the way they had planned. Serac knew that if he were to succeed, he would need to rethink everything. The Zrathar had the power to destroy entire planets, but they had never faced an opponent like humanity. The retreat was swift, leaving humanity with a strange sense of relief. The immediate threat had been driven back, but the victory felt hollow. No one could be certain if the Zrathar would return, or if they had merely shifted their focus to something else. But the world had learned an important lesson. Humanity's resilience, both in body and spirit, was its greatest weapon. The Zrathar might have had superior technology, but they did not understand the power of human determination. As the world began to rebuild, the military and scientific communities turned their attention to understanding the full extent of this new advantage. What did this mean for the future of human warfare? Were there other alien species out there who might now see humans as a threat? And perhaps most importantly, what else could humanity achieve with its newfound knowledge? The Zrathar had underestimated humans, and in doing so, they had ignited a new era for humanity. The battle was far from over, but the human race had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could fight back. The unknown threat had revealed the true strength of the species, its ability to adapt, survive, and rise above any challenge. The world had changed, and so had humanity. This was just the beginning. It was supposed to be just another day, but the skies above Earth had other plans. The world had barely begun to recover from the initial shock of this rather sudden arrival, when the full scale of the invasion unfolded before humanity's eyes. Days of bombardment had left major cities in ruins, and the first wave of destruction had barely stopped. Yet, as night fell, a strange calm settled across the planet. The people, still stunned, found themselves glued to their televisions, radios, and communication devices, waiting for news, for hope. But all they got was more questions. Then, without warning, the sky cracked open. It began with a flash of light that tore through the darkness, followed by a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. People rushed to their windows, staring up in disbelief. High above, visible only as shadows against the stars, massive alien warships descended, blotting out the night sky. They were unlike anything anyone had ever imagined. Black, sleek, and nearly invisible in the dark void of space. Their surface shimmered in ways that defied logic, reflecting the stars and moonlight in strange patterns, almost as if the ships themselves were alive. The military's immediate response was chaotic. Fighter jets scrambled into the sky, launching from airbases across the globe. But no one was prepared for what came next. From the lead warship, a sudden burst of energy shot down, streaking through the clouds and into the atmosphere with a speed and power that made the very air tremble. It hit the ground with the force of 1,000 thunderclaps, sending shockwaves across the region. Cities in the path of the blast crumbled, skyscrapers reduced to rubble in seconds. The ground cracked open as though the earth itself was splitting in fear. In the midst of the chaos, the military commanders were left in shock. They had never seen anything like this. No weapon on Earth had ever been capable of such destruction. The blast, designed to obliterate anything in its path, left nothing but a wasteland. The warships hovered above, their intentions unclear. Was this a message, or the start of something much worse? One thing was certain: the humans were completely outmatched. Major Lucas Grant, a decorated pilot, found himself leading a small squadron of fighter jets, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands gripped the controls tightly, as if he could will his aircraft to move faster. They had to do something, anything, to stop the alien ships from unleashing more of their destructive power. The planes soared into the air, their engines roaring as they ascended to engage the alien threat. As they approached the first warship, Lucas's eyes widened in disbelief. The ship was around it, giving it an almost ghostly appearance. He felt small and insignificant before it, like an ant standing before a giant. Despite the massive scale of the ship, there were no obvious weapons visible, no gun turrets, no missiles. The ship itself seemed to be a weapon. The jets unleashed their first volley of missiles, but they seemed to disappear the moment they neared the alien vessel. The missiles didn't explode or even dent the ship. They simply vanished, as if swallowed by the air itself. Lucas watched in stunned silence as the Zrathar warship responded with a strike of its own. A beam of pure energy shot from the belly of the ship, piercing the sky and heading directly for his squadron. The fighters had no time to react. The beam hit with a deafening crack, and one by one, the jets were torn apart. In a matter of seconds, the squadron was gone. Lucas's heart raced as he pulled away from the battlefield, barely escaping the destructive force. He could hardly comprehend what had just happened. The alien's weapon wasn't just powerful, it was in a league of its own. Humanity's most advanced technology had failed in the face of an enemy who seemed to possess power beyond their wildest fears. Below, the ground was a scene of utter devastation. People ran for their lives as the alien warships hovered over cities, their eerie silence deafening. It was as if the ships themselves were studying Earth, observing its inhabitants like specimens in a lab. There was no communication, no demand for surrender, just an overwhelming sense of alien indifference. Humanity was being tested, but no one knew the answer to the question the Zrathar were asking. How would they react? The world's leaders scrambled to assemble a response. Desperate calls went out to every nation, urging them to unite against this alien threat. But the information was minimal. The Zrathar's technology was unlike anything humanity had encountered, and each attempt to communicate had failed. They didn't understand their enemy, and worst of all, they had no idea how to stop them. Meanwhile, as the world's military forces began to regroup and plan a counterattack, something unexpected happened. An unexplainable phenomenon began to occur. The Zrathar ships, though formidable, had become slower, almost hesitant. It was as if they were experiencing some kind of malfunction. Their precision, once so terrifying, seemed off. The beams they shot now lacked the same power and intensity as before, and their movements grew erratic. Was this a sign of weakness, a flaw in their technology? Major Lucas Grant, now grounded and back at headquarters, looked up at the footage of the alien ships. Something didn't add up. The first attack had been devastating, but now they seemed uncertain, almost like they were waiting for something. What was their next move? Lucas's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slipping just out of reach. It wasn't long before the world's top scientists and military experts gathered to discuss their findings. The Zrathar were not invincible, after all. There was something strange about their ships, something that didn't quite make sense. No weapon on Earth had been able to touch them, but the aliens' own technology seemed to have vulnerabilities of its own. Could the tide of the battle turn in humanity's favor? Despite the uncertainty and fear, humanity was beginning to adapt. It wasn't much, just a flicker of hope, but it was enough to give them a chance. The aliens may have been terrifyingly powerful, but they were not perfect. And for the first time, humanity had seen a glimpse of that imperfection. The fight was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. As the Zrathar warships loomed in the sky, their next move still unclear, Major Lucas Grant and his fellow soldiers prepared for what they knew would be the hardest fight of their lives. The aliens had come to conquer, but humanity was far from ready to surrender. The first encounter was only the beginning, and the world held its breath, waiting to see if humanity could find a way to survive the storm. The world had barely caught its breath after the first devastating wave of the alien invasion. The Zrathar ships, with their unimaginable power, had nearly wiped out Earth's defenses in a matter of hours. Cities had crumbled, military bases had been obliterated, and yet, in the silence that followed the chaos, one thing was clear: the Zrathar had underestimated something crucial about humanity. Their weapons, so advanced and seemingly invincible, had not accounted for the one thing humans had always relied on: their will to survive. And that will was about to show the Zrathar that even the most powerful weapon could fail in the face of humanity's determination. After the initial onslaught, the Zrathar commanders seemed confident. Their weapons had been devastatingly effective, at least at first. The energy beams they fired had torn apart cities and annihilated everything in their path. The Zrathar themselves were calm, calculating, almost detached, as they watched the destruction unfold below. Their arrogance was palpable. The humans, they believed, were nothing more than insects beneath their feet, helpless in the face of such power. But the Zrathar failed to realize something important. They were dealing with a species that refused to be broken, and that refusal was about to turn the tide. Major Lucas Grant, who had barely survived the first wave of the invasion, found himself among the few human commanders left to organize a counterattack. The Earth's remaining military forces were scattered, their resources stretched thin. But Lucas and his team had something the Zrathar had not accounted for: a determination to fight back no matter the odds. Despite the overwhelming power of the alien weapons, humanity had not given up. The attacks on Earth's remaining strongholds had become more erratic, as though the Zrathar were unsure how to proceed. Their weapons, so precise and efficient, were now malfunctioning. The first sign of trouble for the Zrathar came when one of their massive warships, a flagship, hovered above the Pacific Ocean, preparing to launch another strike. Its weapon systems powered up as expected, ready to unleash another devastating burst of energy upon a nearby city. However, when the weapon fired, something went wrong. The energy beam that had once destroyed everything in its path simply fizzled out. It sputtered, crackling in midair, before vanishing entirely. The Zrathar ship's commanders were momentarily silent, confused. Their weapons had never failed before. In a desperate attempt to regain control, the Zrathar tried to fire again. But the same thing happened. The beam failed to materialize, its energy dissipating harmlessly in the sky. The Zrathar warships, which had once been the epitome of power and invulnerability, now seemed vulnerable. Their ships began to move in erratic patterns, as though their very systems were malfunctioning, as if their technology could not function in the same way it had before. Something had changed. Back on Earth, Major Lucas Grant and his team of scientists had been working tirelessly, trying to understand why the Zrathar's weapons had suddenly stopped working. They analyzed every piece of debris from the failed strikes, and after weeks of research, they uncovered something astonishing. The Zrathar's energy-based weapons had been designed with the assumption that no living species on Earth could withstand such power, but they had overlooked one small detail: human biology. It turned out that the specific wavelength of energy the Zrathar weapons used interfered with the human body in a way that caused a strange, unpredictable feedback loop in their systems. This was why the weapons had failed. Their energy beams couldn't properly target the human form. The revelation came as a surprise, even to Lucas. He had always known humans were resilient, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The Zrathar, despite their overwhelming technological superiority, had simply never anticipated that humans could be immune to their weapons. What had once been an invincible force had now been rendered useless against the very species it sought to conquer. The news spread like wildfire across Earth's military forces. For the first time since the invasion began, there was hope. The humans now had a chance. As word spread, a collective resolve began to form. The Zrathar had made a critical mistake, and now humanity would make them pay for it. In the weeks that followed, the world's scientists worked around the clock to develop countermeasures. Military commanders and engineers joined forces, working on new weapons that would take advantage of the Zrathar's newly discovered weakness. Their focus was clear. If they could exploit the Zrathar's weapon malfunction, they might be able to turn the tide of the war. Meanwhile, the Zrathar, still unaware of what had caused the failure, continued their assault on Earth, albeit more cautiously. They had suffered a small setback, but they were not yet defeated. They believed their warships were still more than capable of wiping out humanity, even if their weapons weren't as effective as before. However, they had underestimated human ingenuity and resolve. The humans, battered and broken, had not given up. They had found a way to fight back. Then, in a move that would forever alter the course of the war, humanity launched a daring counterattack. Armed with a new technology that had been developed in secret, a squadron of fighter jets and ground forces targeted the Zrathar flagship that had suffered the earlier weapon failure. It was a bold move, but one that had been carefully planned. The humans knew their best chance lay in disabling the alien warship and taking it out of commission before the Zrathar could adapt. As the jets roared into the sky, Lucas Grant led the charge, his mind focused entirely on the mission. The new weapons they had developed were powerful, and their energy was specifically tuned to disrupt the Zrathar's failing weapon systems. As they neared the flagship, the humans launched their first wave of attacks. At first, the Zrathar seemed to retaliate, but their weapons remained silent. They couldn't fire. The humans were free to strike. The Zrathar flagship, once so powerful and untouchable, now seemed slow and vulnerable. The humans hit it with everything they had, launching missiles, energy blasts, and laser beams. It was an all-out assault. The flagship shuddered under the barrage, and then, with a final explosion, the ship's central core exploded in a burst of light. The Zrathar flagship, the heart of their invasion force, was destroyed. The battle was far from over, but this victory was monumental. The Zrathar had lost their most powerful weapon, and for the first time, they knew they had been defeated. The humans had proven that even the greatest weapons could fail, that even the most advanced technology could be outsmarted. The Zrathar, once confident of their victory, now realized they had underestimated the one thing they could not measure: the resilience of humanity. As the dust settled, the people of Earth began to rebuild. They had learned a valuable lesson. No weapon, no matter how powerful, could defeat a species that refused to surrender. The weapon's failure had been the turning point in humanity's struggle for survival, and from that moment on, the world knew that nothing, not even the mightiest of enemies, could break them. The Zrathar had underestimated humanity's true strength, and in doing so, had sealed their own fate. The skies above Earth had never seemed more ominous. The once confident Zrathar, their alien warships hovering menacingly over major cities, now found themselves in a retreat. After weeks of brutal conflict, the human forces, battered and bruised but never broken, had pushed back with a strength the invaders could not have anticipated. The Zrathar, who had arrived with advanced technology, overwhelming firepower, and an air of invincibility, were now reeling from their first true defeat. Their retreat had begun not because of the overwhelming might of the humans, but because the Zrathar had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had underestimated the will to survive that flowed through humanity's veins. It all started when the humans discovered the vulnerability in the Zrathar's advanced weaponry. The once deadly energy beams that had decimated cities failed to work when aimed at human targets, thanks to the unique biological defenses humans unknowingly possessed. The energy pulses interacted strangely with human biology, rendering the Zrathar's most powerful weapons useless. At first, the Zrathar had dismissed it as a fluke, but soon they realized the truth. They had been wrong about humans. Their weapons, so perfectly designed to obliterate, were now ineffective, and the tides of war had shifted. Major Lucas Grant, a leader among the remaining human resistance, knew that the Zrathar's retreat was not yet guaranteed. Despite their failed weapons, the alien forces were still powerful, and their ships were larger than anything humanity had ever seen. The humans were still outnumbered, and the Zrathar had not shown any signs of complete surrender. However, the failure of their most potent weapon was a blow to their morale that no enemy could ignore. It was a mistake they could not recover from. The Zrathar's first move in the retreat was to pull their flagship, the largest and most formidable of their warships, back from Earth's atmosphere. The ship, once a symbol of invincibility, had become a shadow of its former self. With its weapon systems malfunctioning and the alien fleet beginning to lose ground, the flagship moved toward the outer edges of the atmosphere, attempting to regroup and lick its wounds. It was clear now that the Zrathar were not the unstoppable force they had believed themselves to be. But Major Grant, ever the strategist, knew that this was the moment for humanity to strike. The Zrathar were retreating, but their fleet wasn't abandoning Earth entirely. They were pulling back to regroup, perhaps to recalibrate their weapons or to devise another strategy. Grant understood that if the humans hesitated now, they might never get another chance. They needed to hit hard, fast, and without mercy. His plan was simple yet daring: a direct assault on the Zrathar flagship while it was still vulnerable, before it could escape into the depths of space. As the Zrathar flagship turned away from Earth, a small, determined human fleet, led by Major Grant himself, surged from the planet's surface. It wasn't much, just a handful of fighter jets and a few scavenged warships, but their pilots were driven by the memory of the destruction the Zrathar had wrought upon their world. It was a ragtag force, but they had a single, unwavering purpose: to chase down the Zrathar and make them pay for their invasion. The distance between the two forces closed, the tension rising with each passing second. Inside the Zrathar flagship, Commander Vokter paced nervously. The once proud alien warship had suffered damage during the conflict, and its once sleek hull now bore the scars of battle. Vokter, a battle-hardened veteran of countless campaigns, was not accustomed to retreat. He had been the one to lead the invasion of Earth, confident in his force's ability to crush the human resistance. Yet here he was, watching as the last remnants of his fleet tried to make their way back to their home planet, forced to abandon their objective. It was unthinkable. But as he stared out at the swirling blue planet below, he realized that Earth had become something the Zrathar had never anticipated: a symbol of resistance. They had miscalculated. Vokter's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the communications console. He tried to contact the other ships in the fleet, but the signals were weak, distorted by the damage they had taken. The Zrathar's retreat was not going smoothly. Their forces were scattered, and the humans, once thought to be insignificant, had proven to be far more resilient than expected. For the first time, the Zrathar were faced with the undeniable truth: they could lose. The human fleet, though small and outgunned, pressed on. As they neared the Zrathar flagship, Major Grant's voice crackled over the communication channels. "This is it," he said, his tone calm but laced with resolve. "We hit them now, or we may never get another chance." His words resonated deeply with the pilots under his command. They knew the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for Earth's future. The attack began in a flurry of gunfire and missiles. The human ships, despite their lack of advanced technology, were more agile than the Zrathar's massive flagship. They swooped in, weaving through the debris, evading the enemy's weak and malfunctioning weapons. The Zrathar flagship's weapons, which had once been deadly and precise, could no longer target with any accuracy. The humans, quick and relentless, targeted key points on the Zrathar ship, disabling its engines and weapon systems one by one. Inside the Zrathar flagship, chaos reigned. Commander Vokter barked orders, but his crew could barely respond. Their systems were failing, their ship was falling apart, and the once imposing Zrathar war machine seemed utterly helpless in the face of the humans' relentless assault. The Zrathar were retreating, but they were not escaping unscathed. Major Grant's fleet continued its barrage, hitting critical systems in rapid succession. As the flagship's defenses crumbled, it became clear that the Zrathar had no choice but to retreat further, to flee the solar system altogether. Commander Volktar, now desperate, ordered the last remaining escape pods to be launched, a sign of his surrender. The flagship, once a symbol of Zrathar dominance, began to break apart, its systems overloaded and collapsing in on themselves. For the humans, the victory was bittersweet. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Zrathar were retreating, but they were not done yet. However, the message was clear. No force, no matter how technologically advanced, could crush the human spirit. The Zrathar had underestimated the resilience of Earth's inhabitants, and now, with their retreat, they would be forced to rethink their strategy. As the Zrathar warships flood into the vastness of space, the survivors of Earth's defense gathered on the surface below. The skies were clear for the first time in weeks, the smoke of battle slowly dissipating. Major Grant stood at the forefront, watching the retreating Zrathar ships, knowing that the victory was hard-earned but significant. The Zrathar had retreated, but humanity had proven one thing beyond any doubt. No matter how powerful the enemy, they would never surrender. The fight for Earth was far from over, but for the first time since the invasion began, humanity had hope. The Zrathar had made their retreat, but they had not broken the human spirit. And in that small victory, humanity found the strength to keep fighting. The year was 2150, and Earth stood on the precipice of an uncertain future. The Zrathar invasion had been repelled, but the scars left by their warships were still fresh. Across the planet, cities were being rebuilt, people were healing, and the memory of the battle for survival was etched into the minds of all. Humanity had proven its resilience, showing the universe that Earth was not to be underestimated. But now, as the dust settled, a new question loomed large. What came next? Major Lucas Grant, the man who had led humanity's first successful counteroffensive against the Zrathar, stood on the balcony of the newly reconstructed Global Command Center in New York. Looking out over the city, he saw a mixture of determination and weariness on the faces of the citizens below. There was no celebration, no fanfare. Instead, there was a quiet resolve, a shared understanding that while they had won the battle, the war for Earth's future had just begun. Grant had spent the last few months trying to piece together what had happened during the Zrathar invasion. It was clear that the aliens had underestimated humanity's survival instincts. The energy pulses that were supposed to wipe out human forces had not worked as expected. It was a puzzle that still intrigued him, but he knew that the answers were buried deep in Earth's biological makeup. Answers that he and the scientists at the newly formed Human Science Directorate were determined to uncover. But even as they worked to unlock the mystery, another threat was on the horizon. Reports had been trickling in from Earth's space stations, from colonies on the Moon and Mars, and from distant outposts in the asteroid belt. Something strange was happening beyond the solar system. Alien races, not just the Zrathar, were beginning to take notice of Earth. It seemed that the Zrathar's failure had ignited something far larger, a wave of interest from civilizations that had once viewed humanity as insignificant. Despite their victory, Major Grant felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. The war with the Zrathar had proven one thing: humanity could fight. But could they survive what was coming next? A new wave of alien attention wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. And Earth's defenses, though impressive, were not enough to handle a multi-front war. Humanity would need more than just determination. They would need knowledge, technology, and alliances with other species, if such alliances were even possible. Grant had no illusions about the future. He knew the stakes were high, and the path ahead would not be easy. Yet there was something about the human spirit that no enemy, no matter how advanced, could break. The same spirit that had turned the tide against the Zrathar was what would carry humanity forward into an uncertain future. But for now, the question remained: how would they prepare for the unknown? In the years that followed, Earth's leaders set their sights on the stars. The United Earth Government, a coalition of all nations formed in the aftermath of the invasion, began a massive expansion of humanity's space fleet. It wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about exploring the galaxy, finding allies, and establishing a presence beyond their home planet. They knew that to survive, they had to venture beyond the familiar. They had to face the unknown. The first steps toward interstellar exploration were cautious. The fleet, though powerful, was still young, and the technology that powered the human ships was far behind that of the Zrathar. But the humans were resourceful, and they were learning fast. Using the knowledge gleaned from their first encounter with the aliens, they began to develop new weapons, stronger shields, and faster ships. In the lab, biologists and engineers were working together, trying to understand what had given humanity its edge in the first place. It was not just the human mind or their ability to adapt. It was something deeper, something biological, that had allowed them to survive the Zrathar's most devastating weapons. As Grant continued his work in Earth's Space Command, the first human exploratory fleet was ready to embark on a mission that would change everything. A select group of scientists, diplomats, and military personnel were chosen to travel beyond the solar system. Their destination was unknown, a distant star system that had shown signs of being home to a civilization far older than anything humanity had encountered. The mission was risky, but the potential for discovery was enormous. If they could establish peaceful contact with this ancient race, it could change the course of history. As the fleet prepared to launch, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Everyone knew that the mission's success could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Yet, even as the humans made their preparations, there was a growing sense of unease. No one knew what lay beyond the stars. The Zrathar had shown them the horrors that could exist in the universe, and now humanity was stepping into that unknown. What if the aliens that lay ahead were even more dangerous? What if the peaceful exploration they had hoped for would turn into another war for survival? Grant stood at the command center, watching the ships lift off into the sky. The future of humanity was uncertain, and there were more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: humanity had no choice but to press forward. They had fought to protect their planet, but the future of Earth depended on what lay beyond. The universe was vast, and it was filled with untold dangers, but also untold possibilities. As the first fleet ventured into deep space, the world watched with bated breath. People around the globe held their collective breath, knowing that humanity's fate was no longer tied solely to Earth. They had proven that they could stand their ground in the face of overwhelming odds, but now they had to prove that they could thrive in the vast unknown. The future was a blank canvas, and humanity stood at the edge, ready to paint its own destiny. Whether it would be a future of exploration and alliances, or one of conflict and survival, was yet to be seen. But as long as there were humans willing to fight, to explore, and to dream, there was hope. The Zrathar had retreated, but the universe was still a dangerous place. And yet, in the hearts of humans everywhere, there was a new conviction. They had survived the worst, and they would face whatever came next with the same resolve. It was not the end of Earth's story, but merely the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where humanity, with its courage, its resilience, and its unbreakable spirit, would carve a future among the stars. The Zrathar had shown them that they could fight. Now the universe would show them just how far humanity could go. And if the past had taught them anything, it was that there was nothing they could not overcome. The future of humanity was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would meet it head-on.